Hello, today we're going to be discussing philosophy, what philosophy is. More importantly, the three main topics we're going to be covering are God, ethics, and free will. As we dive deeper into these topics, we will also be going over the different philosophers and their arguments and counter-arguments that were made. The main ones that we'll be hearing a lot as they cover multiple topics are Kant and Aristotle, but we will also be going over Anselm, Guénil, along with Pascal and Mill, how they all contributed to these topics, critiquing one another's arguments and making counter-arguments. Even if they did have similar beliefs, they did go ahead and change certain things, just make deductive arguments that are valid instead of invalid, and what we're looking for is a sound, valid argument with our evidence to back it up instead of just assumption. And we do this through Aristotle's S&P rule. So to jump right into it, philosophy is not your usual field of study, but philosophy came to be understood more as a way of thinking about questions. Why do you do what you do? Why do you think what you think? And why do you feel what you feel? Is the world just made up of matter and energy, or is there something else going on? If it is just matter and energy, then where did it come from? Bring in the question, is there a God? Back in the 11th century, philosopher Anselm created the ontological argument in the backing of the existence of God, claiming that it is greater to exist than not to exist, and nothing greater than God can be conceived. Off of that, we also had his colleague, Guénil, say that just because I can conceive something, such as the Treasure Island example, island with all these riches, doesn't mean it actually exists. And just because we can think of it doesn't mean that it's true, and that we need to have evidence and backing. Many years later, philosopher Leibniz created the contingency argument, which was on the universe and our lack of explanation for how the universe came to be, claiming that something greater must have created the universe, therefore God exists, even with the lack of explanation. And from there, we can look at the cosmological argument and how Aquinas created the first causation argument, saying that things are caused to exist and that it must exist due to something that preceded it in time, and that therefore there must be an uncaused event that created the causal chain. A good example would be like dominoes and how you have them all set up, and there must be an initial reaction or cause to have created that ripple effect on all the other dominoes to have fallen. Philosopher William Paley, in the universe perfect design, there must be a creator or designer, and give an example of a pocket watch, and how it was made, and it was so intricate and somebody must have created it that it just doesn't exist. Hume, on the other hand, objected, saying that with all the imperfections and uselessness, why would we assume that there is a designer? And pretty much claiming there was no evidence or reasoning and lack of evidentialism, where a belief can only be justified if we have evidence to back it up. Clifford said that believing in something with lack of evidence is not only irrational, but also immoral. Later down the line, philosopher James said that in the will to believe, it is sometimes good to hold irrational beliefs for your benefit, just as long as you go with the belief that is a less risky option. So we can bring up Pascal's wager, and if God exists, and if we believe in God, and I will attach a little image that I drew after this clip, showing where we stand, if we believe in God or not, and also if God exists or does not exist, and the consequences for those beliefs. If I'm not truly free to make my own decisions or choose my own actions, then how can I be held accountable for them? Bring in the argument of free will. Do we actually have the power to make our own choices and actions and to choose otherwise, or is it just determinism? When discussing free will and whether or not we do have it, if we claim we do have free will, we do have a moral responsibility to be held blameworthy or praiseworthy of our actions or our character that come along with said free will. On the other hand, we have arguments claiming determinism, where we don't actually have free will and that our life is predetermined and everything goes a specific way. Say you were to pick a banana over an apple, and say you go down later in the future, and then you're like, oh, I want to go to the past and I want to repick and I want to choose that apple, and you still choose that banana. It's kind of just showing that we don't really have free will. It's an optical illusion of free will, and that we live in a deterministic world, causing certain outcomes and creating certain causal chains. And for indeterminism, it's the belief that majority of life is deterministic, but with an exception of at least one event in your life having something where you do have free will to make the decision, such as if you were to go back and were able to choose the apple instead of the banana. That would also be a good example of an indeterministic world where everything else is preset, but there is an event where you can choose one or the other. Bringing up Leibniz from the ontological argument, he believed that God foresaw all of the outcomes, choosing the best one. Therefore, our actions are not of free will. On the other hand, philosopher Hume, he believed that we acted on our desires, and pretty much that our motivations are what cause us to have our certain desires, and those desires then turn into action. As we get into semi-compatibilism, we will be discussing a few philosophers such as Frankfurt, Fisher, and Dennett, where some of them believe that even though it's a semi-compatible, semi-deterministic world, like a deterministic world, that you still are held morally responsible for your actions, even if you did not have a choice to do otherwise. Bringing up the argument that we discussed in class, saying if we were to have a chip implanted in our brain somehow when we were born, and then we were to go and do a voting poll, and say you were to vote one way or the other, and if you were to vote, say Republican, they would change your vote into a Democrat. So it would be something where you are still held morally responsible for your actions, but you did not really have a choice. So pretty much determinism means that we aren't really held responsible for our actions, that it's all predetermined. But when we get into free will and being able to actually make our own choices and actions, we are held responsible and do have moral responsibility for said actions. Ethics asks the practical question of what should we do? Is it ethical or unethical? Getting into ethics, we will discuss the three different ethical reasonings, such as rule-based, outcome-based, and virtue-based. Bringing up Kant again and the ontological argument, he is a strong believer in the moral worth of an action is judged by its maxim or its intention. He also believed that actions were morally correct when they abide by rules or categorical imperative. On the other hand, we have philosopher Mill, who believes in utilitarianism. We can break this down into act versus rule. Act is a case-by-case basis, and to bring up a good example is a stop sign in the middle of nowhere and nobody's around you. What do you choose to do? Do you choose to run the stop sign, or do you choose to do what the law is? Essentially, your actions don't matter as long as you aren't causing any harm. Lastly, Aristotle brought up the virtue theory, and the golden rule is not the mean of action, it's the mean of virtues. Good example is to be polite instead of rude or a people pleaser. With all said and done, all of these topics we take into account to build good philosophical arguments that are sound and valid. Also must remember fallibilism, a principle that recognizes our beliefs or knowledge can always be subject to error. This is essentially what makes a good philosopher, and creating more arguments to broaden their knowledge.